Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and the soundboard is not cooperating, and it's October 24th, 2018. Wow, BTR is deathly slow tonight. I'll say right off the top, all the audio clips I'm using tonight, when I made them, when I listened to them, they sounded a hell of a lot better than they're sounding through this soundboard. Thank you so much, Blog Talk Radio. Just transition. How do you change a way of life for towns, nations, and the world? This will be going on for our lifetimes and probably longer. Now, if you don't know what this two-word policy of the present and foreseeable future is about, you will soon. With once-in-a-century storms happening every decade or less, with the insurmountable amount of scientific evidence growing every day, with banks around the world refusing to finance new fossil fuel infrastructure, Kinder Morgan, the writing is on the wall. Humanity must break the carbon energy addiction, and fast. Now, despite the status quo denial game plan from political parties on the right, the reality is already taking place on the ground. It was the Harper government that was first to legislate an end to coal-fired electricity generation in Canada. The Alberta NDP government accelerated the timelines as part of their climate leadership plan. And private generating utilities, it's Alberta, of course they're private, they've sped up things even more. In their business models, coal as a fuel is over ASAP, not 2030. 4 provinces in Canada use coal-fired electricity: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. The only one to start a just transition program is Alberta. In 2013, 52% of Alberta's electricity was coal-fired. By what's looking like 2022, that percentage will be 0. Pretty quick for a decade. Complete towns are at stake. No power plant, no coal mine, no miners. No miners, no community, no municipal tax base. And the other motivator that's not being talked about, but will be more, is automation of carbon energy jobs. That's only going to accelerate. Now, a few other places on Earth have started this process, none without problems, despite best-laid plans. There simply are no case histories. This process involves ministries and departments from multiple governments. Blue-Green Canada hosted the 3rd annual Just Transition Conference in Edmonton on October 22nd and 23rd, involving everyone affected, involved, and interested. And this is the episode on it. Now, what exactly is this? And specifically, what is the 3rd annual Just Transition and Good Jobs for Alberta conference about. It provides an update on the coal and jobs transition, what governments have been doing and need to be doing to ease that transition, and what other transitions that are coming and need to be prepared for. It was an evening for a couple hours, and then it was a full day. A lot of people involved directly in the process were involved to speak, to advise, to inform, as it has been every year. It started off, of course, like most things like this do, with an appearance from a relevant government minister. We were addressed by Alberta Minister of Labour, Christina Gray, member of the Legislative Assembly for Edmonton Mill Woods. Little reminder, Edmonton Mill Woods provincially is within the federal riding of Edmonton Mill Woods. Its MP currently is the Natural Resources Minister, Amarjeet Sohi. Now, as I said, I'm not real impressed with the way this stuff sounded when I listened through, but it's not that bad. It should sound better, but it's not that bad. This is Minister Gray opening the conference.
And so welcome to everyone who's here from outside of Alberta. I hope you enjoy the workers' paradise that you have now come to. I maybe won't use that everywhere, but I like that very much. We do have some really great things happening in Alberta right now. We are Canada's fastest growing economy in the country. We have the highest minimum wage in Canada with $15 per hour, and we have modernized our health and safety laws and expanded people's rights at work, including better leave provisions for workers to care for loved ones who are sick without fear of losing their jobs, which is something that was happening before. We've improved and expanded on our skills training programs, and we're working with companies across Alberta to get the latest insights on the demands for green job skills to help create our own good green jobs. When our government came into office, Alberta was burning more coal than the rest of Canada combined. More than half our electricity was coal generated. Now, Alberta has North America's strongest climate plan with a cap on emissions, a target of 30% renewable energy by 2030, and a phase out of coal-fired electricity. And things that we are working on are obviously very much in line with the work that Blue Green is doing and the reasons Blue Green was founded. We need more voices like yours to say that we no longer have to choose between the economy and the environment. We can and must advocate for working people and a clean environment at the same time. As Premier Notley says, an economic plan that does not work on climate change is no plan for the century ahead. And a climate plan that doesn't work for working people is no plan at all. And those aren't just words in Alberta, they are actions. And I know you will be discussing transition and just transition in depth. And I noted on your agenda that the day ends with recommendations to federal and provincial governments. So I look forward to getting your advice and hearing the results of your conversations today. But I wanted to talk just a little bit about what our Alberta government plan has been so far. We have been working hard to help diversify our economy through renewable energy and energy efficiency. We are replacing coal with renewables and natural gas to reduce our emissions. We've also changed the rules to allow old coal plants to run on cleaner natural gas because just transitions also need to be realistic transitions. We've already seen hundreds of jobs created in wind and solar sectors, and even more in making our homes and businesses more energy efficient. Some believe that the way to move forward on climate change is to leave workers behind. Like Blue Green, our government does not believe that we should or can leave those workers behind. And that includes the coal workers in our province. Our government is really proud to have set up the $40 million Coal Workforce Transition Fund to support affected coal workers. That includes a program that provides financial assistance to reemployment, retirement, relocation, and education as workers prepare to start new jobs or retire. Under our program, there are 3 streams of grant relief: one for workers transitioning to retirement, one for workers who plan to look for new jobs and qualify for employment insurance benefits, and another for relocation assistance for workers who move to start a new job. Our government is also helping workers who need more education or training to transition into new careers by providing tuition vouchers of up to $6,000 per year for 2 years. And we are helping to establish workforce adjustment committees involving unions, employers, and community stakeholders to address workforce transitions. Each committee will plan their own actions or activities created by the people who will benefit from them, such as arranging specialized training, connecting affected workers to employment opportunities, and providing workers with timely information about job openings in the region. We know that phasing out coal won't be easy in communities, including First Nations communities that rely on the industry. That's why we're really pleased to be funding economic development work in 19 communities to help them identify new strengths and opportunities. Almost $5 million in funding has been delivered, and we look forward to helping these communities prosper in tomorrow's economy. At the same time, we've continued to push the federal government to contribute its part in supporting Alberta's coal workers. Moving forward, we are broadening our economic base in agriculture and manufacturing, in high-tech and tourism, and in petrochemicals and environmental technologies. With new industries comes demands for new skills. And that's why we have improved and expanded our skills training program, allowing more flexibility and support that we provide to Albertans and preparing them for new job opportunities. All of this under the kind of constant conversation that we know our world's climate is changing, and Alberta is not immune to the effects. So we owe it to our kids and our grandkids to take real action on combating climate change. I'm really proud of our climate change plan, and that Alberta is a continental leader in this. I'm also proud that we're devoting climate funds to support Alberta workers as we continue to diversify our economy and make it more sustainable. And I'm most proud that our Premier, Rachel Notley, is fighting for what matters for working Alberta families. Unlike previous governments, she's making sure no one is left behind this time as our economy continues to recover. We're helping to make positive changes and become less exposed to resource roller coaster of oil prices. In Edmonton and Calgary, for example, expanding the light rail to help people get around with fewer emissions. Green Line in Calgary is a great example of how we can succeed when we work together, how we can create good jobs in a cleaner economy. This future light rail line will help about 60,000 people get around every day and create 20,000 jobs. And it will reduce emissions by 55,000 tons every single year. This is the sort of long-term investment that I'm really proud that we are making, because it's good for communities, it's good for people, it's good for the economy, good for the environment. These are all things that I know Blue Green stands for, and it's what our government stands for as well. So thank you very much for inviting me here today to give my version of our story, and then I know there will be other speakers talking about their perspectives. I look forward to receiving the results of your discussions today and continuing to work with you as we move Alberta forward. Enjoy your conference. Thank you.
An intelligent address, not overly patronizing, taking advantage to talk about what they have done. And as an Albertan, I will say there's a lot of things that the minister mentioned that are long overdue. But that's the minister's viewpoint. The next main item on the agenda was an address from Gil McGowan, who, as you will hear him explain, is wearing many hats these days. His primary occupation is the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. Gil McGowan was there to give a talk, and the title of it was A Look at the State of Work and the Energy Transformation in Alberta. Here's the first part of Gil's address to the Just Transitions Conference. You may hear a voice from the audience once or twice. It may be familiar to you.
Over the last few years, I've had the privilege of wearing a lot of hats. many of which are related to the conversations that we're having today. So for example, as the chair of what we call the Coal Transition Coalition, which was the coalition of unions who represent people, coal mines and coal-fired power plants here in Alberta. So they represented the people who face the prospect of losing their jobs as a result of the coal phase-out. So through our coalition, we negotiate with the government the Just Transition Package, which Mark mentioned off the top. So that's one thing that's kept me busy for the last 2 years. In addition to that, I sit with Mark as a member of the federal government's Just Transition Task Force, talking about coal phase-out across the country. For about 16 months, starting about 2 years ago, I also had the privilege of being appointed as the co-chair of something that the government calls the Energy Diversification Advisory Committee. So, and we're talking about diversification primarily in oil and gas, but it's, talking about diversification of the economy. So, but today, last 2 years I've spoken at both the previous conferences here in Edmonton and the first conference in Edmonton, the conference last year. I spent most of my time talking about the coal transition, the coal phase out, and the need for just transition for the workers who were facing the prospect of losing their jobs. As you've already heard, we've been largely successful in our efforts to secure a just transition for those workers, and there's about 2,500 of our members. Through months and months of hard work with the provincial government, we've been able to come up with the package that Christina described. So I'm not going to go over that territory, and it will also be addressed in the panel before the lunch hour. But what I want to do instead is put on my other hat, which is the hat for my day job as president of the Alberta Federation of Labour. And one of my big jobs as president of the Federation is to scan the horizon, looking for threats to working people here in the province. And there's no shortage of threats. As most of you know, our economy has slowed down. We're recovering from a recession. But there's something bigger looming out there that the unions affiliated with the Federation of Labour have identified as perhaps the #1 biggest economic challenge facing our province. And it is what we describe as the energy transformation. Most people have seen bits and pieces of it, and in many cases, people get pretty passionate about some of those bits and pieces. But for a province like Alberta, that is an oil and gas producing province, we in the Federation of Labour we believe that it's really important to connect the dots and to understand the scope of the change that we're facing and identify both the threats and also the opportunities. So what is this energy transformation that we're talking about, and why is it important? Well, let me just start by saying a couple of words about what Alberta is. Alberta is Canada's energy province. Everyone knows that, but I'm not sure if you're from the province if you know just how important oil and gas is to our province. If you look at our GDP, if you think of it as a big pie, fully 35% of our GDP comes from oil and gas. And so, that's people who are directly employed in oil and gas. If you include energy-related construction, that pie grows even bigger. It's close to 50%. So when we say that we're Canada's oil and gas province, it's not just that it is an important industry. It is the industry that looms over everything else. So anything related to the future of the oil and gas sector is of paramount importance to our province. So when we look at what's happening around the world, there are developments that have huge implications for this big chunk of our economy. And so when we talk about the energy transformation, we're talking about a transformation on at least 3 dimensions. The first has to do with the transformation of the energy economy itself. And this was in bold relief back in 2014, 2015, when the price of oil collapsed. Now, people, if you're not Albertans, you probably knew that it collapsed, but you might not know how much. So, oil was trading for about, it briefly touched $140 a barrel. And in a brief 6-month period from the end of 2014 to the beginning and middle of 2015, it dropped down to $30 a barrel. So we have never seen, Alberta is a province that has seen ups and downs, we've seen booms and busts, but we have never seen that much of a collapse in the price for a major commodity in such a short period of time. So from $140 a barrel to $30 a barrel. And given the size of the oil and gas industry for our economy, you can see how that would be very devastating. So people saw the collapse in price, but what most people don't realize is what's behind it. And what was behind it was a glut. And that glut was generated by technology south of the border that has transformed the oil and gas landscape in the United States, but also around the world. And so what I'm talking about is the technologies of hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling. When you put those together, it's caused a revolution in the oil and gas world, basically allowing oil companies to extract oil from formations that previously had been uneconomic. So how big of a deal was hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling? Well, to put it in perspective, as recently as 2006, 2007, so basically just a decade ago, the United States produced just slightly more oil in a year than we did here in Canada. They produced about 5 million barrels a day, and at the time we produced about 3.5. Well, how has it changed? If you look at the United States today, the United States is, as a result of these new technologies, the United States is producing more than 10 million barrels of oil per day. So they have more than doubled their production in less than a decade. And to put this in perspective, the United States now produces more oil than Saudi Arabia. Now, how many people knew that? Okay, so what the result is twofold. Two big issues for Alberta. First is that the fracking-related explosion of production in the United States completely threw off the global supply and demand balance for oil. And that's what led to the price collapse in 2014 and 2015. But the other thing that's important is, for the purposes of Alberta, is that what had been our major customer has now become our biggest competitor. And to put this in perspective, I just want to just point out that we're pushing about 4 million barrels of oil from Canada right now, production. Almost all of it's from Alberta. And just how much of our export production do you think goes to the United States right now? How much? Any guesses?
95%.
95%, that's a good guess. It's actually higher. It's closer to 99%. We export almost nothing to markets other than the United States. So you can imagine, so when the price of oil, when the production in the United States goes up, they basically double their production, the price collapses as a result because they've thrown off the global supply and demand balance, and our customers are starting to get to the point where they can support themselves. So when we talk about the energy transformation, that's the first dimension. Our biggest customer has become our biggest competitor, and their increase in production has thrown off the global supply and demand balance, setting off what it will be sort of like a series of gluts as far as the eye can see, which puts downward pressure on the thing that we sell. Okay, so that's the first dimension. The second dimension of the energy transformation, as we describe it, has to do with the way oil and gas companies are responding to this new energy reality. And they're doing it the way corporations often respond when they're confronted with a challenge. And they're doing it by driving down costs, and one of the ways that they try to drive down costs is by getting rid of jobs. So people have all heard about driverless trucks at Suncor, which is our biggest oil sands producer, is in the process of introducing driverless trucks. They're going to, their plan is to basically get rid of all the drivers in their heavy haul trucks. But Imperial is doing it, Cenovus is doing it, and this is literally the tip of the iceberg. Basically, every company in the oil and gas sector is finding ways to cut corners, cut costs by cutting jobs and introducing automation. And this is significant for Alberta because we sort of had this deal with oil and gas companies here in Alberta. It's not a deal that I ever agreed with, but it was this tacit agreement that you can pay us low royalties in exchange for exploiting our publicly owned resources, and in exchange, we'll get jobs. And most Albertans are pretty satisfied with that deal. It was sort of our oil compact, right? Low royalties for jobs. But now, where prices look like they're not just going to be lower for a little while, but lower for longer, there might actually be some oil companies that say prices are going to be lower forever because of fracking in the United States. So, and so this is significant from a labor point of view because the energy sector, which has been a big generator of jobs, can no longer be counted on to generate as many jobs, even if they do come back. Okay, so that's the second dimension of the energy transformation. So the first is our biggest customer has become our biggest competitor. The second one is oil companies are responding by cutting jobs and automating away employment. The third dimension of energy transformation, and I purposely put it third. The third dimension is perhaps the biggest. And that has to do with climate change and the fact that in response to climate change, the world is moving away from fossil fuels. In this jurisdiction, in Alberta, and as an oil and gas producing jurisdiction, we have to look at climate change on two levels, right? First we have to look at climate change from the point of view as citizens of the world. And the threat that we're facing was thrown into sharp relief just a couple of weeks ago with the release of the IPCC's latest report. And as most of you know, the scientists who were involved in that panel came to a very stark conclusion, and it was that if we don't start taking much more aggressive action on climate change, we will be past the point of no return, not in 20 years, not in 50 years, but in only 12. So they basically came to the conclusion we have 12 years to save the planet. Not 12 years to start taking climate action, but 12 years to actually get to the point where the climate action is significant enough that we can turn the corner. So as for Albertans, including everyone who works in the oil and gas sector, we're at a crossroads. We have to decide whether or not we will get behind efforts to deal with climate action, or if we will continue to be part of the problem. As you heard from Christina this morning, the good news is that the Alberta government does have a continent-leading climate leadership plan that includes a cap on emissions from our biggest emitting sector, the oil sands. But as you also know, the political situation is getting more tenuous, and the forces who oppose climate action are gaining strength. But in terms of dealing with the threat of climate change, Albertans as citizens of the world are, more and more Albertans are getting their head around the fact that we have to do something. And I just want to say that it's not just about Alberta, it's also about Canada. If Canada is going to meet their climate goals, Alberta has to be part of the solution. Because I'm going to throw another statistic out at you. Here in Alberta, we've got 12% of the population. How much, as a percentage of Canadian emissions, how much do you think comes from Alberta with 12% of the population?
80.
No, not quite. That'd be terrifying. But it's 40% of Canadian greenhouse gas emissions come from this province, and the majority of those come from the oil and gas sector. So the reason I say that is that if Canada is going to meet its climate targets, as a country, we can't possibly do that without Alberta. So, so dealing with climate change is an issue for Alberta, on two levels. The first is we're citizens of the world. There's a problem that needs to be addressed. If we don't address it, the consequences are dire. This is not something we can put on the back burner any longer. And Albertans are actually starting to see the effects, not just on the front page of newspapers. They're actually seeing the results of climate change in our own communities, in our own lives. So if you were here in the summer, for example, you would have seen a province choked by smoke from wildfires. That was related to climate change. You were here, during the last winter when we had weeks of days when it was above 10 degrees. You'll note that's a result of climate change. For the last 4 summers, we've experienced unprecedented droughts that are putting our agricultural economy, especially in the southern part of the province, at risk. That's a result of climate change. So Albertans can. We can pretend to ignore climate change, but climate change won't ignore us. It's here. So that's the first reason we need to talk about climate change as part of this global energy transformation. The second reason why we've identified climate change as a threat to our members and working Albertans in general is because the rest of the world is going to respond to climate change. In fact, they are doing it already. And in the wake of the IPCC report and yet another summer where temperatures were so high in many parts of the world that people were literally dying, the reality is that more countries, citizens in more countries and the leaders in more of those countries are going to start demanding climate action. And when they do, they're going to start moving away from fossil fuels. And I would actually say that is, in terms of focusing the minds of people in Alberta, that's the message that has to get out. We can ignore climate change, but it won't ignore us. We can pretend that everything will be fine if we keep drilling and producing, but the reality is the people that are our customers, whether it's in the United States or in states like California or these new markets that we hope to access, those governments are already starting to move away from fossil fuels. So, we've heard about decisions by governments in Europe to introduce bans on internal combustion engine vehicles, starting with countries like Norway, France. The EU as a whole is now talking about setting a path towards moving away from internal combustion engines. Now even big countries like China, traditional laggards, are recognizing that they have to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels as well. And this is the reality that Albertans have to get their heads around, is that just because we keep drilling, just because we keep producing, doesn't mean that the world will keep buying. And this is not just something that environmentalists are saying. Just like a month ago, one of the biggest energy consultancies in the world, Wood Mackenzie, they make their living giving advice to oil and gas companies, and they came out with a report dealing with projections for global demand, and they came to the conclusion that global demand for fossil fuels will peak in 2036 and start to decline thereafter. There are some other prominent groups that are saying that the peak will come sooner, but it's important for us, for Canadians in general, but Albertans in particular, to recognize that it's not a question of if demand will peak, it's a question of when. So it could be 2040, it could be 2036, as Wood Mackenzie said. It could start happening by 2020. In fact, most economies around the world have already reached peak demand. It's really just a few of the big economies, primarily in Asia, where demand is increasing. So that's as a labor movement here in Alberta, representing thousands and thousands of people who work in oil and gas, we've come to the conclusion that it would be irresponsible for our province, for our industries, and for our government to ignore the fact that peak demand for oil is coming. And so what we've done as a labor movement is we're trying to start a conversation about the energy transformation and what it will mean for the Alberta economy, for Alberta businesses, for Alberta workers, and we want to make that conversation about the energy transformation something that politicians can't ignore in the lead up to the next provincial election. And so we launched a campaign called Next Alberta, and because basically what we're saying is that there will be a next Alberta beyond the one that we're living in right now, which focuses so exclusively on oil and gas. And the question is, what will that next Alberta look like? And it will have, like here in our province, it's almost become a joke that politicians talk about the need to get our, all of our eggs out of one basket, we need to diversify. It's been one of those things that, politicians since Peter Lougheed in the 70s have talked about, but we haven't really accomplished. But what we're saying is that, with peak demand looming, with the world moving away from fossil fuels, the question about diversifying the Alberta economy has gone from being a rhetorical or political device to being an outright economic imperative. Okay, so what we're hoping to do is start a conversation. And I'm just going to, if we can, I'm looking at the technician at the back. We have 2 videos that we've produced. Each is about 1.5 minutes long, and they're aimed at starting this conversation and talking about the threats, but also the opportunities that come from dealing with energy transformation. So if you could just roll the...
Well, when it happened there, the technician could not play the videos at that time. Technical difficulties. Some very obvious facts in that part of Gil's speech, but they're not things you see in the newspaper. They're not things you see on TV. And I think the statement that everybody has to hear and understand and accept is that our biggest customer has become our biggest competitor in a decade. And that former customer is the one where upgraders for diluted bitumen have been built in the last 20 years. Not Canada. Well, one. They built 5 or 6 down on the Gulf of Mexico. They expanded some in California. Gil laid it out. Who calls the shots for us? But at this point in time, I will play the 2 videos from Next Alberta. And Gil is correct. It is trying to start a conversation. I think these are very excellently produced public relations material. Here's the first one.
Here in Alberta, we're facing the biggest job in our province's history. That job is preparing ourselves for the transformation that is sweeping our oil and gas economy.
Fracking and horizontal drilling technology south of the border have turned our biggest customer into our biggest competitor.
Oil companies are responding by automating away jobs. You've heard about how they're introducing driverless trucks in the oil sands? That's just the beginning. They're literally increasing production while employing fewer people.
At the same time, like it or not, the world has started the long bumpy process of moving away from fossil fuels.
It's not going to happen next week or even next year. But sooner than later, the world is going to want less of what we're selling.
What all of this means is that Alberta's future is going to be defined by change. Change that will present both big challenges and hopefully big opportunities.
So how do we prepare for the future that's unfolding in front of us?
The main thing is to get the right tools. In this case, we're talking about the policy tools used by government.
There are 3 things we need to be ready for the challenges of the energy transformation.
First is the investment in people, especially things like education and healthcare, so that individual Albertans don't have to worry about extra costs, and so they have the skills to be innovative and adaptive.
The second thing we need is investment in infrastructure. Things like roads and schools, yes, even pipelines, so that we can keep people working and so that our businesses can be more competitive.
And maybe most importantly, we need to invest in diversification, not only within our oil and gas sector, but beyond it, so we can squeeze the most that we can out of our current economy.
And use that wealth to build a bridge to a more diversified and prosperous future.
Learn about the energy transformation. Visit nextalberta.org.
Very well focused. Delivers a lot of information in a direct fashion in a short time, and poses questions that have kick. They're short. The words go together. They're easy for people to remember. That was more about the issue. The second one from Next Alberta is a little more focused.
In order to be prepared for the change that's unfolding in our energy economy, we need to work together and invest in ways that will help us manage risks and seize opportunities. This is a pull-together moment for our province.
Anyone who tells you they're going to wave a magic wand and bring back the good old days of $120 oil simply isn't being straight with you.
And we need to be very skeptical of people who say we should copy Trump.
Or people that say the answer is more tax breaks for the wealthy and more cuts to things like education and healthcare.
Those policy tools never really worked for ordinary people.
They just made the rich richer. We'll never be able to afford the things we need to manage the energy transformation if we're giving away money to people who already have it.
Trying to deal with the energy transformation by using the usual right-wing toolbox would be like trying to hammer a nail with a stethoscope.
Or trying to take a pulse with a hammer.
So here's our advice. When you go to the ballot box in the next election, choose politicians who acknowledge that change is here, instead of those who deny it.
Choose politicians who have a plan for going forward, instead of those who pretend we can go back.
And choose politicians whose policy tools will make us better prepared to deal with change, instead of politicians whose tools will leave us unprepared.
Remember, if you want to do a job right, you need the right tools.
So let's choose our future by choosing politicians with the right tools for the jobs at hand.
Learn about the energy transformation. Visit nextalberta.org.
Well, again, valid points. They sound a little more directional, shall we say. It paints a picture that not having a plan is insanity. I would tend to agree with that. But in the context of Alberta, that points you in only one direction. But I don't think that's really that uncommon in other places as well. Still, if those start hitting the TV and the radio in Edmonton with frequency, they will have their impact. And at the end of the day, the issue is opening the bigger discussion. As Gil said, these, I think, could do it. Here's the next part of Gil's speech.
So the obvious question is, if Alberta is facing a profound transformation in global energy markets, and that transformation is going to crack the very foundations of our provincial economy, the question is, what do we do about it? And as a labor movement, we've come together with a package of solutions that we're recommending to government, and which we're hoping to get people talking about in advance of the next election. They start with short-term, medium, and long-term. Some of the short-term stuff, not everyone in this room is going to like particularly. I'll just fair warning, but you'll see the direction of where we're proposing to go. So in the short term, what we're proposing is that we very consciously use the wealth that's generated by our existing oil and gas sector to build a bridge to a greener future. What that means in practice is actually porting the existing upstream oil and gas industry for the time that they have left before global demand collapses. And making sure that as Albertans we get as much as we can out of that 10, 15, 20 years of production, so that we can generate employment, but also generate revenue that can be taken in by the government and used to fund a transition. So for that reason, our labor movement has been supporting the provincial government in their efforts to build a pipeline to Tidewater, that's their favorite phrase, so that we can access markets other than the United States. But I just want to put it in context. We support that because we want to use the economic activity and the revenue generated by our existing oil and gas system very deliberately to raise the resources necessary to build a bridge to a greener future. So that's in the very near term. In the medium term, we're suggesting that the government focus on diversification within the oil and gas sector. So as I mentioned, demand for oil as a commodity is expected to peak and start declining very quickly after 2036, and with the added urgency to issues related to climate change, that actually might happen much sooner. But demand for things that are made from oil and gas is not declining in the same way. So, for example, petrochemicals and plastics, there's still a robust demand, and especially as countries like China, more people move into the middle class, they start demanding more consumer goods to live that middle class style, kind of lifestyle. And so there's an opportunity for us as a jurisdiction that's rich in oil and gas and the other feedstocks that can be used for this kind of industry, pivot away from extraction towards added value, things like petrochemicals and plastics. Over the longer term, and by long term I'm not talking 100 or 200 years, I'm talking more like 30, 40, 50 years, there's an absolute economic imperative for us to stop putting all our eggs in the oil and gas basket and diversify beyond the sector entirely. And so with that in mind, our federation, representing the unions in this province, have entered into a partnership with the Pembina Institute, and we are in the process right now of trying to develop a blueprint for diversification beyond oil and gas. That would be ideas for economic development, specifically in the Alberta context. And we started that project. We're hoping to have it done in the next couple of months, but we want to go beyond sort of these generic statements and platitudes about green jobs, and actually turn it into a blueprint that is applicable to the Alberta situation. And just to give you an example of how our blueprint for Alberta might look different than a blueprint for a province that isn't an oil and gas province, we are of the belief that one of the first things that should be done to a greener economy is actually green the economy within oil and gas itself. So, when we talk about green jobs, we're not just talking about jobs in industries that are more commonly seen as green, but a green job could be a job in oil and gas where you're helping to, for example, reduce methane emissions or reduce the amount of emissions coming from a big oil sands project. If that's reducing Alberta's carbon footprint and helping Canada to reach its climate goals, that is as much of a green job as a job in an industry outside of oil and gas itself. So we're hoping that in the next month or two, we will actually have a very detailed and achievable green jobs blueprint that we can carry forward jointly from the labor movement and the environmental community, and that blueprint hopefully will become something that we can talk about during the lead up to the next provincial election, and it will be our effort to sort of shift that conversation away from where it is right now, which is the sort of the single note that we hear from the right, demonizing the carbon tax without any recognition that it has something to do with climate change. But we want to reintroduce this idea that dealing with climate change is not only an environmental imperative, but it's an economic imperative, and that the cost of doing nothing is actually higher, not even over the long term, but over the medium term, than the cost associated with introducing, for example, carbon pricing. So we have an ambitious goal in front of us. We have a relatively short time frame. Our time frame that we're working with right now is between now and the next provincial election, which is expected in May. So only about 6 months, and in that time, we're hoping to take on Jason Kenney, Doug Ford, this anti-carbon tax alliance, and expose it for what it really is, which is just cheap political theater. And we do want to send the message that at this crucial time in Alberta history, but indeed in the history of the world, the last thing that we need is to be led by people like Jason Kenney, Doug Ford, Donald Trump, people who deny that climate change is happening, people who ignore the reality that the world is moving away from fossil fuels. We need to instead be led by people who understand that change is not just necessary, but it's already coming, and that we have to, especially for oil-producing jurisdictions like Alberta, we have to start preparing to adapt to that change, mitigating the risks associated with that change, but also seizing the opportunities. And I just want to wrap up with two things. First, on the subject of opportunities. I think there was a study released just recently saying that the transition to a greener economy actually represents business opportunity of unparalleled magnitude. The estimate is that to change our system from one based on fossil fuels to one that is a greener economy would generate something in the order of $30 trillion of business investment over a relatively short period of time of only about 10 years. The question that Canadians should be asking, including Albertans, is if there's going to be that much economic activity generated, instead of ignoring the opportunity, we should be asking ourselves, how can we get our share, our piece of the action? The final thing that I want to talk about is ideology. And this goes back to the point I made about people like Jason Kenney being the last people who should be in charge right now. You know, the challenges that we face as a province, as a country, and as a global society are on such, they're of such an unprecedented magnitude that and the time that we have to deal with them is so short that the only way that we could possibly deal with these challenges and succeed and survive as a species is to engage in collective action on a scale that we've never seen. That means mobilizing our resources through the mechanisms that we have at our disposal, the most obvious mechanisms are taxation through government. Governments aren't evil. Governments are the mechanisms that we use to do things collectively. Taxes aren't evil. They're the ways we pool our resources to do things that we couldn't do individually. And the problem, though, is that conservatives like Jason Kenney, like Doug Ford, and Donald Trump, the reason that they're the wrong people at the wrong time to deal with this crisis at the most fundamental level is that they don't believe in collective action, especially collective action through governments. And they certainly don't believe in pooling resources to deal with issues of public concern through the tax system. And we simply can't afford to be led by people who don't believe in government, who don't believe in taxation as a tool for the public good. And we certainly can't be led by people who don't believe in collective action. Because honestly, collective action through the institutions that we've built, both public and private, is the only way that we can deal with the challenges that are in front of us. So that's the bad news. We have to make sure, at the end of the day, we can talk about, green job blueprints, we can talk about diversification, we can talk about the threats and opportunities presented by climate change. But at the end of the day, and this is what the IPCC report came to the conclusion, at the end of our day, the biggest problem right now is it's not science, it's government, and it's politics. And maybe here in Alberta we're a little bit more focused on that right now because we're only 6 months away from an election. But for us, the biggest threat to Alberta right now is Jason Kenney. He is a threat magnifier, right? So we have all these threats looming on the horizon, most of them dealing with climate change. But if we choose him as our next premier, not only are we going to miss opportunities, but he's going to fail to prepare us for this change that is bearing down on us like a freight train, and he'll leave us unprepared, he'll leave us exposed, and he'll certainly make sure that we miss the opportunities that the transition presents as well. So, I don't so that's why we're starting this conversation, that's why we're trying to insert ourselves into the public discussion before the next election, because, we're trying to start this conversation and convince people to engage in this conversation as if their future their future depends on it, because it does. So anyway, if you haven't already done so, I would encourage you to visit our campaign website. The campaign is called Next Alberta, and the website is www.nextalberta.org. And we would appreciate, if you're not in Alberta, we'd appreciate it if you would sign up to get updates from the campaign and share it with your friends.
All right, fair enough. Delivering what he sees as the core issues, which is certainly not what you're going to find in the pages of your post-media newspaper. But I find that to be a very good phrase. They are not the right people at not the right time. Jason Kenney, Doug Ford, Andrew Scheer, Donald Trump. It's brief, it's to the point, and it's not really partisan. Not bad. Now the last clip is only 6 minutes. I don't know why it sounds so poor when I upload it on BTR. It's like there's some kind of fan going. But this is the last recorded piece to play, and it's about the layout of the just transition.
The government committed to phasing out coal-fired power, and that was a big deal for us because, as I think Mark mentioned at the beginning, more than 50% of our electrical power was generated from coal-fired power stations. So when the plan was announced, we had 18 coal-fired power units at 5 different plants, and then there were also the associated with coal mines. If you look at everyone who worked at those facilities, it's about 2,500 people. Almost all of them were unionized, which turned out to be a blessing because, well, obvious reasons, but they had representation. So we were able to mobilize on their behalf very quickly and act as a voice for workers to negotiate a transition. So the first thing that we did was create a coalition called the Coal Transition Coalition, and we started conversations with our own members to talk about their anxieties, their fears. The first thing that we had to do was just get their heads around the idea that this was going to happen, because their first inclination, and I think this is the inclination for workers facing the loss of jobs anywhere in any sector, the first inclination was to fight to find a way to keep their jobs. And so our first job was actually to go to the employers and say, is there a way that you can actually make these plants compliant with the new rules about reducing emissions to zero? And we actually commissioned a study, an engineering study about carbon capture and sequestration to see if we could actually, turn these plants into net zero plants. And the engineer said, yes, it's possible, but there's a price tag. So we took that price tag to the companies, and the companies basically laughed us out of the room. They said natural gas is cheap, and the government's going to give us money, so why would we keep these plants running? And it was only at that point where, when we presented, in good faith, we took our members' concerns, we tried to address them, keep their jobs in place. It was only when it was clear that the companies were not interested in that happening that we could get on to the next phase of the discussion, which was talking about a just transition. So we formed a coalition, started negotiating with government. As you heard this morning, it resulted in a package of transition measures that included income supports. So there was a top-up to EI, so that people would be able to earn up to 75% of their pre-unemployment earnings for an extended period of time. So that would help them bridge the gap to new employment. So that was the first stream. The second stream was training and reskilling, and also skills recognition. We had a lot of people who had worked in either the coal plants or the coal mines their whole careers, and they had lots of skills, but they weren't necessarily transferable. So, and a lot of people actually finished. They didn't pursue education, and so they were terrified about going out to the job market, even though they were making good money, on operating heavy equipment, dealing with some pretty advanced technology within the plants, but they didn't think they could go out to the labor market with the skills that were not transferable to other employees. So second stream was education, so skills upgrading, trades training, and one of the things that we really wanted was that for the workers to be able to choose themselves what they wanted to train in. So we convinced the government to give us provide an educational voucher worth up to $12,000 that could be used at a trade school, at a college, at a university. So that was the second stream. The third stream was for the workers who were closer to retirement. And so we wanted to build a pension bridging program. And so if people were within 3 years of retirement, we got the government to agree to fund a bridge. And then the final thing was relocation, as you mentioned. I just want to mention, this is a huge victory. This is the first just transition plan that has been negotiated by workers with government, implemented anywhere, as far as we can tell, anywhere in the world. A comprehensive one for everyone involved. But there are still a couple of hiccups that we're trying to work out right now. So the first is that the education voucher, we wanted it to be available to people before they actually lost their jobs, so they could start upgrading while they knew they were going to lose their job, but they were still working. And that was really important to us, so we wanted the transition to be seamless. Unfortunately, the bureaucrats intervened, and they said, well, we can't give a program to someone who may not need it, meaning that you only know that they need it when they lose their jobs. We said that's bullshit. And so we're in the process right now of trying to work with the government at the highest levels to push the bureaucrats aside, get them to live up to their original commitment to make the program available sooner. And then the second one is the pension program. Each one of our pensions is a little bit different, and we're having a hard time designing a pension bridging program that fits with all of them. And so, but the government is negotiating with us in good faith to find a system that works. The final thing, just one more thing, which is a big issue for us. The Just Transition program that we developed here in Alberta is very much supply side. It's focused on giving workers tools for them to be successful in the labor market. But at the end of the day, what workers really want is another job. And so we tried to introduce this idea of, matching employers, say, in clean energy with workers who are losing their jobs, so that they would leave one job and go to another. But our labor market systems like EI and our training systems, they're not designed for that. And so it's an institutional problem, it's an ideological problem that we have to get over. And so at a federal level, with the federal task force, Mark and I have been trying to introduce this idea of more focus on actually, redeploying people from one job to another, rather than just saying, here's a couple of training courses, now, you're on your own. So that was the missing piece in the Alberta plan. But other than that, it's a pretty comprehensive program. It's well funded, and the government there are a couple of hiccups, but the government is working with us in good faith on them.
A lot of what he said there is noteworthy, and someday it will be historic. As he said, this is the first just transition agreement framework negotiated with direct input of workers anywhere in the world. Now, before we get into the specifics of what this program is and what has been delivered and what is stumbling, there's a random factor, and that comes from industry. There's uncertain timing. Not only is this the first time that anything like this is being attempted this way, anywhere, the timing is getting shorter and shorter, which means everything has to be running the way it's supposed to be faster and faster. And as more people come into the Just Transition program and more plants close, those are stress tests, shall we say. And as Gil said, that whole thing about the education voucher, if you can't get your hands on it until the day you get your record of employment, how are you getting ahead exactly? There are some hiccups. But provincial and federal governments, well, I should say, this is from the backgrounder for the conference. So this is from Blue-Green Canada. Now, provincial and federal governments of all parties, Conservative, Liberal, and New Democratic, have set deadlines for eliminating pollution from coal-fired electricity generation plants. The final furthest out deadline is 2030. That's a federal. But coal plant owners have been announcing closures and conversions from coal to natural gas several years ahead of government deadlines. Fracking dramatically reduced the price of natural gas, making it a more profitable investment for the privately owned generators. In the U.S., gas-fired generation already has overtaken coal-fired generation. Other causes of job losses not originally factored at this rate include mothballing of plants and the decades-long practice of owners replacing workers with capital automation. Market forces are creating uncertainty about the dates of upcoming layoffs. Some may happen sooner than currently anticipated, and it is possible that all plants could end up closed or converted to gas years before the 2030 deadline. Now, what I heard in the room and at the socializer the night before, it could be 2022 before conversions are complete. That's a lot quicker than 2030. Now, what about government action? Well, the uncertain timing of closures, conversions, and layoffs means that both governments need to take action and implement just transition plans more quickly. Despite decades of talk about just transitions, mainly by labor and environmental organizations, it's rare for governments to engage in the planning. The fact that the Alberta and federal governments of Canada have done so is, in the words of Blue-Green Canada, remarkable, and has caught the attention of observers around the world. The questions revolve around whether their action will be adequate and quick enough. Well, the Alberta government came out with their plan in 2017. At that point in time, Blue-Green Canada put out a statement on it. Blue-Green Canada applauds today's announcement by the Government of Alberta of funding and other crucial supports for workers and communities in the transition from coal to lower carbon electricity generated by natural gas and renewables. Alberta's plan represents the clearest commitment to a fair and just transition for workers and communities by a government in Canada to date. In our conversations about the coal phase-out, people are looking for certainty and plans that will help them support their families. This plan, paired with the necessary work ahead with the utility companies, unions, impacted communities, and governments, is an important part of providing certainty and a successful transition for Albertans. They covered a few of the points that the government plan the Alberta government plan has, which we'll get to in a minute, but they said, however, for Alberta's plans to have the most impact, they must be supplemented by the federal government. The federal government has a responsibility to help this transition succeed by allowing greater flexibility and access to federal programs such as employment insurance for impacted coal workers. Now, the Alberta government action is underway, but how impactful is it? Now, the Alberta government carried out its consultations and in 2018 implemented a set of supports to affected workers and communities, similar to what Blue Green Canada had proposed in 2017. Now, Alberta's supports include the Bridge to Reemployment Grant, which tops up EI to 75% of your previous salary for up to 45 weeks. The Bridge to Retirement Grant of up to 75% of previous salary for up to 72 weeks for workers not yet eligible for employer pensions. So, that would be people most likely from 52 to 55 years old, I would guess. Up to $5,000 relocation grant for workers who moved more than 40 kilometers for a new job. The Coal and Electricity Transition Tuition Voucher of up to $12,000 to pursue post-secondary education to train for new careers. And as Gil said, that means universities, colleges, trade schools. On-site career counseling services, including one-on-one or group meetings to develop individualized plans on job finding, applications, and interviews, and to help access government retraining programs. On-site transition to employment services, including individualized planning, identification of skills and potential fit with new jobs, First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous training to employment, workforce adjustment support to help workers, employers, and unions develop worksite transition committees and strategies, obtain labor market information, access existing programs, arrange specialized training and job fairs for the affected employees, and match people to job openings. Gil touched on all that in that last clip. Financial assistance for employers to train new and existing employees. Financial assistance for affected communities to undertake economic development initiatives and investing in creating green jobs and renewable power generation. That's a pretty long list for a pretty comparatively small number of Albertans. But this isn't just losing a job, finding another employer in the same field. This is the end of an industry. Now, Blue Green Canada says it will also depend on the design of the provisions and whether there are gaps that some workers could fall through. What they see as questions so far. Are the levels of support adequate and long enough? Are there gaps that the Alberta government could fill? Are there gaps that the federal government could fill? Has the government ensured that the private sector plant owners will provide preference in other jobs for affected workers? That has also been on the table, not in big numbers, of the utilities offering jobs at other places for some of these employees. But it is a small percentage. And the biggest question of all, will these worker supports be available under future Alberta governments I think the Ontario experience is looming on this. We've seen how many programs, especially the basic income experiment in Ontario, that one morning had to go. These were discussed in workshops, and it was made clear, as Gil touched on, there are problems with just about every one of these services, but they are being provided. And as I said right off the kickoff, there are no case studies to do this. It is a huge task. Federal government action. Well, it was in the first week of April in 2018 that there was an announcement from the federal government on what they were going to do about just transition. April 4th, Hill Times. This is Carla Lipsig-Mume. The Trudeau government is poised to launch Canada's first federal task force on a just transition for workers affected by policies intended to mitigate climate change. In this case, it's the government's plan to virtually eliminate traditional coal-fired electricity generation by 2030, which may put up to 3,500 coal miners and power workers out of work in 4 provinces. The task force announcement comes more than a year after the government declared its intention to phase out coal in November 2016. That was a reaffirmation of the Harper policy on that. Since then, coal-dependent communities have been left wondering if they had been forgotten by the federal government, and Labour leaders have been calling for action by Ottawa. Establishing the Just Transition Task Force is more than good policy, it's good politics. Policy-wise, the terms of reference released by Environment and Climate Change Minister Catherine McKenna on February 16, 2018, tasked the 9-member panel and 2 co-chairs with providing knowledge, options, and recommendations to the minister on implementing a just transition for workers and communities directly affected by the accelerated phase-out of coal-fired electricity in Canada. The federal budget included $35 million to support those efforts. Now, politically, by acknowledging and acting on the need, the government is helping to ensure that it continues to generate the social license required to combat climate change and to move the country down the challenging path of the transition. Public opinion currently supports climate change fighting efforts. But if working people are left with greater economic insecurity than before, a backlash could be generated. Members of the panel will have diverse backgrounds, including workforce development and sustainable development experts, a past executive from a major electricity company or utility, and a municipal representative appointed in consultation with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. The 5 remaining will be drawn from Labour, including the Canadian Labour Congress, a provincial federation of Labour, that's the AFL, and 3 from unions representing affected workers. They followed the Alberta model on setting up a task force. Membership on that panel is a good deal. Let's say we wouldn't see 3 people from the unions if Harper was around. What does Blue-Green have to say about federal government action? The federal government announced the creation of a task force on just transition for Canadian coal power workers and communities, with significant representation of the labor movement. The mandate of this JTTF is essentially to consult widely and provide recommendations. Now they look at a couple points in the terms of reference. Engage with relevant stakeholder groups, provinces, and municipal governments on the scale and type of impacts on directly affected workers and communities, opportunities to transition affected workers and communities towards new economic opportunities. For example, renewables, leveraging existing allocations of infrastructure funds, economic development funds, employment and training programs, and any other programs, and also engage over gaps in policy and programs to support this transition. I can confirm for a fact that this is happening. One of the people at the table I was at for the conference was a federal employee who worked for economic diversification for Western Canada. The other one they highlight is provide options and recommendations to the minister on what could be included in a just transition plan and how to structure a subsequent phase of consultation and analysis concerning just transition. Specifically, there's more coming. We know that. Now, the JTTF is to report its findings to the minister in December 2018. Every year there's a blue-green conference. There's always some report that we're waiting for. Last year it was the Alberta committee we were waiting for. This year it's the federal one. It is uncertain what policies the federal government will adopt in response to the recommendations of the JTTF and recommendations of others. The Alberta government has asked the federal government to amend the EI program to enable workers to receive Alberta's income supports without reducing their EI payments and to extend the duration of EI benefits for coal workers. So there's another hiccup that's popped up. There's a clawback going on. Despite the Alberta government guaranteeing supports, it costs people on EI. And again, that's because the benefits weren't accessible until they were unemployed. So yes, hiccups. The questions that Blue Green Canada brings up about the federal program is what policy changes will they recommend? Will it be about EI? Will it be about Canada Pension Plan for those close to retirement? Will the federal government action be quick enough before too many people get laid off with the accelerating timeline thanks to the producers? Will the levels of support be adequate? Will there be gaps that other levels of government can fill? And again, will the supports be available under future federal governments? Legitimate questions. But how come nobody ever asked them except Labour? Now, one of the big parts of this is jobs. This is all about jobs. As Gil said during his speech, you can promise training, etc., and support, whatever. What these people really want is another job. That's the only thing they want. They want another job they can fit into. They have to move. They have to do this. It happens. But give them a job. That's all they want. So one of the big workshops at the conference was about jobs. Again, going to the backgrounder from Blue Green Canada. Previous Blue Green Canada conferences have noted the need for workers to be able to transition into good jobs. Jobs with decent pay, good working conditions, and the ability to organize, which is what they are coming from. Many of the good jobs created in the past were made good and kept good through union bargaining, which also served to raise standards in non-union jobs. Absolutely correct. Unfortunately, Canada's unionization rate is low compared to many developed economies. And since 1980, Canada's unionization rate has declined, along with, surprisingly enough, the decline in middle incomes. Alberta has taken steps to improve employment standards and labor relations in order to improve existing jobs. However, the province's unemployment rate is still high. More jobs are needed. The provincial government has announced job creation policies. For example, the renewable electricity generation, RFPs, and economic development support in transition-affected communities. The government has specifically asked requests for proposals for renewable electricity generation projects not of a massive scale, but geographically important to the affected communities. Because remember, even if these people all get new jobs, what if they all have to move away? What happens to this town where the number one employer is out of business? So that's a very good point. So they're looking for specifics. I think that takes some guts. Now, questions that Blue Green Canada is considering. Could the government expand its good job creation efforts? For example, in future rounds of renewable generation requests for proposal, add criteria for building Alberta's manufacturing base, invest, for example, carbon levy revenues in public transit and publicly owned utility-scale renewable generation facilities. Now, what they're pointing to here, I'm dating myself, and this still goes on in Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories. Back in the 70s, towns had their own cable network. They brought the signals in, they transmitted them to the houses in the town. It was a cooperative. They had control over what they saw on their TVs. They had control over the level of service they had. It was theirs. This is a suggestion of taking that old school approach to renewable generation facilities owned by the town that supplies the town. It ain't free. You still pay for your electricity, which in turn pays for employees. Something else, build good jobs in the methane emissions mitigation and oil site reclamation industries. Higher regulatory standards. There's been a lot of talk the last little while about the poor state of reclamation in Alberta. I believe it's been over a year since the stories first broke that the so-called reclamation fund that was supposed to be funded by the oil and gas industry has nowhere near enough money in it to execute its mandate. So guess who they want to pay for it? Us. There are a couple slides in the slideshow that talk about methane mitigation. There is so much money being let escape existing infrastructure that can be captured and sold for money, and nothing's being done. Are there labor standards and labor relations policies that could be further improved? Is the government setting targets and tracking the number and quality of positions available to and being entered by the affected workers? Should indirectly affected workers, some of whom may be marginalized in, for example, retail and food services, should they be covered? Are there other measures that could be taken to ensure that more of the green jobs being created are good jobs? Now, again, some of those questions are because there's no data. There's no background on any of this stuff. Now, something we were asked to do in a workshop was to talk about jobs. It came down to 3 big industries where transition is going to have an effect, because the best line I heard all weekend, or the day and a half, transition will happen. The just part is the hard part. That's true, as Gil mentioned. World economies are going to move where they want to move. It's going to happen. So we better prepare. Now, as far as jobs at the workshop, transport, mostly public transport, the electricity industry, and, believe it or not, oil and gas. I broke it down in opportunities, challenges, and supports. Now, under public transportation, the opportunities. All you hear about is, especially in cities, there's not enough mass transportation. But also similarly, with the move to more efficient vehicles, we're seeing zero emissions buses on the roads already in low numbers. Profitability was the biggest reason that Greyhound is disappearing from Canada, and the isolation from something like Greyhound disappearing to these towns in Alberta has a real effect. As the transition comes, will there be opportunities to establish businesses with zero emissions buses, most likely subsidized from, say, carbon levy dividends, to allow these people to make a thriving business? What are the challenges? Well, functionability and accessibility. What are the supports that are out there for an expanded public transportation industry? The demand is there. Usage is the one thing that hasn't moved yet. But what is the biggest thing you always hear about? More people should take public transit. Screw that, I'm driving my car. That will continue to get more expensive. The electricity industry, what are the opportunities? With the RFPs, there are internal markets to be created. There's also, as asked for, manufacturing can be established. Alberta has some of the best solar energy locations in the entire world. I think I've said this once before on this show, but I'm going to say it again. When you look at photovoltaic collector panels, solar panels, they are all measured to a lab standard. Certain conditions, temperature, humidity, etc. And when they talk about what they can generate with their PV cells, you can buy the most efficient panel out there that may be rated at 98% in the laboratory. You put it out in the Alberta winter sun, and it will operate at 140 or 150% efficiently, quite safely, because of the low ambient temperature. It exists. If they were manufactured here instead of in China, if there is a big enough demand, why would there not be manufacturing here? What supports are available? The Carbon Levy Fund, first and foremost. In oil and gas, what are the opportunities? Reclamation and methane capture. There is so much work to be done. Nothing, basically nothing is being done about methane capture in Alberta or BC. What are the challenges? Well, of course, everything with oil and gas, profitability, cost, and what's going to happen about the liabilities that oil and gas have is yet to be solved. What supports are there for oil and gas? We're not even going to go there. There is a lot of conversation, and there are options, but not enough people know about them. Now, the last thing they wanted to cover at the conference was other transitions, starting already as this one begins to be implemented, as the hiccups are identified, as the process works, as they try and get better at delivering this globally new program, being prepared for other transitions. Now, the coal transition will affect thousands of Alberta jobs, and it appears that other transitions could affect tens or hundreds of thousands of Alberta jobs. These job losses will arise from government policy and from changes in the private sector. For example, driverless vehicle technology will soon eliminate at least 400 positions in the oil sands. These are ore truck drivers for the most part, drive the heavy haulers, all unionized. Well, Syncrude has their own union. 400 fewer. It's going to be at least 400, because I'll tell you right now, even the smallest open pit mine in Fort McMurray has 4 shifts at all times, likely a 5th one, with about 8 to 12 people on each one. And I'm sure there will be a reduction in the number of mechanics, as that will become more automated as well. So, I mean, you could see 400 at every mine, easily. Millennium, Suncor's Millennium, has automated trucks now. Steep Bank North will be next. Syncrude has announced a pilot project, which is probably out at Aurora. I'm not sure where it is. But this is definitely coming. Never mind that, driverless vehicle technology will eliminate tens of thousands of positions everywhere else. Never mind in the coal sector, in the oil and gas sector, in Alberta. The shift from oil sands mining to in situ extraction and the adoption of other technologies will mean fewer jobs in the long term. Trade deals will continue to incentivize companies to hire workers in low-wage jurisdictions, outsourcing the jobs and importing the services and goods, and a potential reduction in global oil consumption, whether due to policies of various importing countries' governments or technological change, such as electric vehicles, could reduce the demand for Alberta oil at a rate that we don't really know about. The Alberta coal transition had a long warning time. As of 2012, the Harper Conservative government had already regulated retirement dates for most of Alberta's coal plants. Some of these above-mentioned transitions are predictable, but the dates of others are unclear. In order for these to be humane transitions, it is essential to be prepared to develop scenarios for the probability, scope, scale, and timing, and to develop strategies for managing them and their impact on workers and communities, looking ahead in a big way. Now, the possible questions about this topic: do we have the necessary information to be prepared to manage these transitions? Well, obviously the answer is no, and that's why Blue Green Canada is asking the JTTF to have in their report a regimen of data collection and a willingness to take data from anywhere they can get it, basically. Because, as I said, this is an empty file cabinet for just transition. Our federal and provincial social policies, which specifically employment insurance, Canada Pension Plan, old age security, social assistance, education and training, childcare, affordable housing, are they strong enough to enable employment changes and provide a safety net for those who need it, who are experiencing transition? This is a scary picture if you look at it, with a little bit of fictional latitude. If there is a sudden lack of oil or a sudden discovery of something other than fossil fuels, and there's a rapid movement away from it, these under 5,000 workers and their families could basically be one grain of rice in the bowl. This is something that has to produce results. Let's put it that way. And as Gil said, if you include oil and gas construction, along with directly being employed by oil and gas, that is 50% of the Alberta GDP. We have to move. We have to move fast, but we better do it right, or there's going to be an even worse price to pay. I've been to all three of these conferences. This is a professional organization. They are affiliated globally. A lot of good people. Thank you to Jamie Kirkpatrick for putting this together in reality. Also thanks to Mark Rowlandson and Joey Warnock of Blue Green Canada. A shout out to Alejandro Bravo for once again being a kick-ass conference moderator. Met some good people, had some good conversations, but it's the focus, it's the inquisitiveness that you find in organizations like this that interest me so much. And, I accept the logic of their premise. This is going to be happening. It's happening now, but not in huge numbers. But it is happening now. There were a couple mayors also there from Alberta towns. Charlene Smiley, the mayor of Wabamun, which has, I believe, 3 coal-fired units on Lake Wabamun, west of Edmonton. Chris Warwick, mayor of Hanna, Alberta. They will also be looking at a complete change in the way they do things. I believe it was Mr. Warwick that said the line, "Transition will happen. The just part is the hard part." It's going to be interesting, and it's going to be something that we can't get wrong. Well, we can, but it's not recommended. This, when you talk about changing, like I said in the title, it's changing a way of life. And for now, it's towns. It will be nations. It is happening in nations already, as Gil talked about, with the mandating of outlawing internal combustion engines. When that starts happening, the clock is ticking. And sooner or later, the world. So just transition. Familiarize yourself with it. It will be coming to a place near you. It's inevitable. If you're interested in the work of Blue Green Canada, that's their website, bluegreencanada.ca. Otherwise, that's a wrap for tonight. Next Wednesday is Halloween. At this point, I intend to have a show. But what's on it? Couldn't tell you. That's it for tonight. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. Just transition. We'll see you next week. Good night.